Hi, I'm Jay Paulson. I'm a member of the board here at Knappton Cove Heritage Center, but my involvement with the center started the same as most of you, as a visitor who wondered just what this place was. My wife and I had driven past the sign out by the highway many times over the years, but it wasn't until we'd moved to the coast and saw a notice in the local paper about the center that we decided to include it in one of our get-to-know-the-place trips around the area. The day we drove into the parking lot to check it out, Nancy came out to greet us as we got out of the car. I'd spent my career with the Public Health Service, but quickly learned that Nancy knew more about the history of the PHS and its Commissioned Corps of Officers than I'd learned in over 30 years in the service. You're about to see why, and I hope you enjoy learning about Knappton Cove as much as I have.
Knappton Cove is a small protected bay on the north side of the Columbia River, right where the Columbia River meets the Pacific Ocean, the mouth of the river. And the mighty Columbia, which is about 4 miles wide right out here, has presented this space with an incredible amount of human activity over the years. So this heritage site provides us with really a microcosm of American stories. We have history starting with the Native Americans here, and then the explorers from all around the world were starting to come into this area. They'd come to the mouth of the Columbia. 1805, Lewis and Clark paddled by. They opened up this whole area for westward expansion, and with that we saw the pioneers coming west with the promise of a donation land claim. And then, as the settlers settled in, we had immigrants from around the world coming. They'd heard about all these great opportunities here in America, and specifically this area was offering lots of jobs in the lumber industry and the fishing industry. So we had all kinds of immigrants coming into this area. And at that point, there really presented a need for a U.S. quarantine station, with all these immigrants bringing their diseases. So there was a U.S. quarantine station here for nearly 40 years. And then at a certain point, we didn't need those quarantine stations here anymore, and so it was closed, and then it became a sport fishing camp. And now we have a museum to talk about all these layers of history. It's been an exciting journey to watch our nonprofit grow and be open to the public and see what stories come our way. We continue to have people coming by with new stories every year. However, my mother is really the reason this thing is going here. She is the true inspiration. She, from doing tons of yard work to interviewing all kinds of people of interest and planning special events, she has kept this place going with this nonprofit for 25 years. Now we'd like you to join us as we dig into the past, look at some of these artifacts.
I'm going to tell you about the significance of these blue beads that you see here, these 7 precious beads, because it relates to the first actual documentation of this historic site. In 1792, Lieutenant Broughton, under the command of Captain Vancouver, with the British ship, the HMS Discovery, that was Vancouver's ship, but the Chatham was the ship that came across that treacherous bar and got over here. Unfortunately, the British arrived 5 months after Captain Robert Gray, so they didn't get to claim this territory. But Broughton was commissioned to moor his boat somewhere near the mouth of the river and go upstream as far as he could and name some significant places. And that is why we have the British influence of Vancouver, the city of Vancouver, which was Point Vancouver, Mount Hood, named for a British admiral, and even Young's Bay across the river from us here. That was the first actual recorded history of this site, because while Broughton was upriver, he left a skeleton crew here at the cove who moored right out here, right in front of us, where the quarantine station eventually was established, because it's a safe moorage place. And while he was moored there and his commander was upriver exploring and mapping, he traded with, according to the records, the Indians, and that would have been the Chinook Indians, who were probably camped here to fish, because guess what? This is a good fishing hole out in front of us. And most of our story relates to that good fishing out there in front of the station. And the Indians traded daily for fish. They traded the fish they were catching to the crew that was left here. And the trading things they used were blue beads like we found here later, and buttons. That was another thing. And they did note in their log that the ladies came on daily to be adorned with beads and buttons. But that was the primary trade thing that they used. One day, my husband was mowing the grass out here, and he kicked over a molehill, of which there are, oh, so many, and lo and behold, he came up with these Indian trade beads, and he came in and showed me, he said, look what I found in the molehill. So that kind of added some credence to actually that Chatham being moored here, although it is actually recorded and is in their logs, so we know that this was the place that it was established. So that's the beginning of our story here at Knappton Cove. Now we're moving along in history up to 1814, and a mystery occurs at this point. In 1996, I found a map that designated this area not as a quarantine station, not as Knappton Cove, but Todd's Bay. And I thought, well, there's a mystery. And like the mystery detectives on TV, I delved into that bit of history and had a lot of fun with this. I found, as I looked back at our other records, that the donation land claim, which comes a little later than this, actually refers to this site as Todd's Bay. So I thought, that's interesting. Why would they call it Todd's Bay? And upon further research, I found out one of the supply ships that was accompanying the British fleet that was out here looking to take over Fort Astoria, because they said, we have British control over here, we have the fur trade, and we want to get out there. And they are prepared for war. They're coming equipped, and they have some supply ships that come with them. One of the supply ships was called the Isaac Todd. Well, the first ship that came was the Raccoon, which is well documented, and they sailed in across the mouth of the Columbia and found this underwhelming Fort Astor. At this time, the fellows who had been commissioned to come out here to form this fort for John Jacob Astor were a little peeved, because they thought Astor just forgot about them, and they weren't getting any feedback, any supplies, nothing was coming to them. And really, most of them were Canadian voyageurs that had been hired to do this. And they could have cared less, and they said, yeah, you guys can have it. So the British came in and raised their flag, the British flag, and it became Fort George. Well, finally, the Isaac Todd, who was coming behind the Raccoon, spent quite a lot of time to get here, and this is where the story gets kind of interesting. Back in England, before they were ready to leave, Donald McTavish went down to probably a pub on the port in Portsmouth, England, and there he met this voluptuous blonde Jane Barnes. And looking ahead to this long voyage that they were going to be taking all around the Horn and up to the Pacific Ocean, he thought, it wouldn't hurt to have some female companionship along. So he finagled to get Jane to sign on as the ship's seamstress. So Jane said, sure, she'd come along for the ride, why not? She hadn't got any better offers. She did require a few things. She wanted bottled pork, tinned beef, and plumes. You don't want to go to America without your plumes, and a sizable wardrobe. So they met those requirements, and Jane did indeed board the ship. Well, the problem with Jane is that she was pretty flamboyant, and by the time they got over here, they did, by the way, have a stopover in San Francisco where I think she may have refurbished some of her plumes. They finally got here. And when they got here, Jane appeared over at Fort George in all her splendor, and she walked the beaches daily, both evening and night, usually with a different hairstyle and probably a different plume, and it just drove the guys mad at Fort George. And in fact, even the tribes that were over there were also a little fascinated with Jane. So they decided, we got to get Jane out of here. She is just disrupting everything. Let's take her across the river And they said, there's this little protected cove over there, and we can take Jane over there, and we'll just take the Isaac Todd, because we're a little crowded in the port here. We've got 3 supply ships plus the Raccoon. And they did indeed moor the boat right out in front here. And we think that Jane was probably the first person to be put in quarantine at this station. This is way back in 1814. We don't know exactly what happened to Jane. It was recorded that eventually a Jane Barnes did turn up at the fur trading office back in Portsmouth requesting back pay because she had indeed served as a seamstress on that ship. Evidently that was denied, but we don't know for sure. It's rather a mystery, but it does solve the mystery of this being named Todd's Bay. Now we're moving up to 1853, and Manifest Destiny was in full swing, and this is the era of the Oregon Trail and people flocking to the west, many of them because they were getting free land. The donation land claims were available, and of course there was also a little, maybe you might find some gold, and there were possibilities for a lot of younger folks that were coming across the Oregon Trail to stake out the West and see what it was like. In 1853, Job and Sarah Lamley, and we'll see, there's a picture of their house. They built a stately home on their donation land claim here. And interestingly enough, on that deed that they got, guess what? It was labeled as Todd's Bay. So we know from Jane Barnes' story why that name was established here. Job has an interesting story. He crossed the plains in 1849 and he arrived in Oregon City. And he was lured here by the prospect of gold, not here, but in California. So he said, I'm going to go down to Astoria and catch a ride down to San Francisco, and I'm going to go out and look for some gold. Well, the ship he got in Oregon City, the Josephine, did not make it very far. It shipwrecked, crossing that treacherous bar, and here is Job. And he survived, but he dragged ashore across the river, almost in Owaco, Washington, and managed to survive, and he was quite entrepreneurial. He got odd jobs here and there, and eventually he met Sarah Wilson, who had also crossed the Oregon Trail. She came with her parents, and she was actually a shoestring relative of President Wilson. And the families had known each other back east, so they kind of knew each other. But anyway, they got married in 1847, and that was when they built the first structure that was really built on this piece of land. And they built this beautiful, stately home right down by the river here. They had a lovely river view, and Job was a seafaring man by that time, a pilot on the river. We found artifacts that from that house. The house was demolished when the government bought the land. It was in disrepair and it was burned. But when my mother was out poking around doing gardening after my folks acquired this site, she found some artifacts, and she found these little doll parts and some of the hardware that had probably been on a piece of furniture that had, after the burn, that was salvaged. So that's evidence of this pioneer family that settled here in the mid-1840s.
In 1876, Joseph and Sarah Lamley, who had the donation land claim here, sold the western portion of their property to Joseph Hume, who was one of 4 Hume brothers who had many canneries on this river. In fact, between the 4 of them, there were they had over half of the 40 canneries that were here on this river. Joseph Hume was the youngest brother, and we know that he was here. We have 3 really wonderful salmon labels that we have had a lot of fun with. The first one, you can see as salmon labels came along in history, they got better. The first one we have is a very crude drawing. It's got a picture of Joseph Hume, the world renowned. It's a very simple label. And the early canning labels were often printed in red. And that was because the early canning methods often produced cans that rusted pretty easily. So the red disguised the rust on the early labels. The next label we have is a really special label that just came into our museum a year ago. It was the granddaughter of Dr. Bayless Earle, who was one of the first assistant surgeons here when the station was just being transformed into a quarantine station from the cannery building. It was in the possession of his granddaughter, so we assume that Dr. Bayless Earle must have found some labels hanging around the buildings here. And this is another beautiful red label, but you can see the picture of the salmon is a little more detailed. It's a very beautiful label, and it's got a very fun image over on the right-hand side where you have a globe and you have two women, one dressed in an American flag type outfit, holding hands across the ocean with someone of royalty on the other side. And so this tells you they were really marketing to the whole world here. This salmon was going everywhere. It was huge. There were a lot of cans of salmon being made here. And then our very favorite salmon label, which is the first one that we found actually, is very, very beautiful. And you can see on this label we have the salmon, but we also have Lady Liberty. And so the fun thing about labels is that you look back into history and you see the cultural events that were captivating the country at the time, or the world in fact. And you may know that the Statue of Liberty was a gift from France to us, and it was delivered in the late 1800s, about 1880s, somewhere in there. And so they were putting this on a label. They were selling this beautiful artwork on the label around the world. And instead of a torch, if you zoom in, you will see she is holding a salmon in her hand, and then in the other hand that normally would hold the tablet, she's got a huge can of salmon. It's really showing the opportunity here for the world to come over here to America. The other thing to note is that you'll see a bridge in the background of this label. Well, we didn't have a bridge out here until about the 1960s, so this was not, this was a dream. You could kind of see that Astorians were hoping they were the next New York. This looks quite a bit like New York Harbor at the time. The other very interesting thing about that label is that it was only after this label would have been produced and used on these cans from the cannery here that we had a quarantine station here. So this symbol that's associated with Ellis Island was really rather prophetic in being on this can, because we became the Ellis Island of this region. So very fun history to see how things are woven in here. Another thing interesting to note is the Hume brothers were the first to employ the Chinese laborers here. They were hard workers. They weren't allowed to fish in the river, but they were kept in these cannery buildings, and they cut up these fish day and night, canning all these cans of salmon. We know that from the 1880 census, there were 70 Chinese people employed here at the station, and when you look at the pictures of the cannery buildings here, you can see there were 2 levels, and it's quite likely they did the work on the lower level and then lived above on the top level. And we find a lot of Chinese shards out in our grounds here. They still come up from time to time. And we find other things like clay pipes, and we have a couple sake bottles that were under the porch that Grandma found. So there are some clues that we did indeed have a pretty thriving Chinese population here for a time.
Now we kind of wonder what happened to the cannery. Well, by the 1870s, the salmon market was glutted. The salmon were declining, the runs were decreasing, and of course more people were trying to get that canned salmon out to many countries, and the profits then began to decline. So the canneries began to combine, and they would, a lot of them were sold, and this was one of the canneries that went up for sale, so it was closed. But by 1899, because of the increased ship traffic on this river and really worldwide, and ships were coming from around the world to this port of entry. The lumber and canning industry had taken off, and there was lots of traffic. Well, those ships were pretty confined. They were mostly sailing ships at this time, and they were close quarters in those ships, and disease began to spread. And in fact, there was a saying at that time that where ships go, so goes the plague. Well, nobody wants to get the plague. And this was a pandemic, and the United States decided in its way to deal with it. And the best way to deal with any pandemic is to quarantine. In 1899, the government established this quarantine station. This was one of 4 on the West Coast. Of course, Ellis Island opened earlier. It was on the first one to open on the East Coast. But there were about 40 ports of entry that had quarantine stations around the periphery of the United States because we did not want infectious disease to get into our country. And that included not only the plague, but typhoid fever, yellow fever, smallpox, cholera. Those were all significant diseases that we really wanted to protect our people, our citizens, from getting that. Actually, the Public Health Service was put in charge of protecting people that came into the United States. But at that time, it was not called the Public Health Service. Our Public Health Service began as the U.S. Marine Hospital Service. And you have to realize that our Public Health Service really is connected to this early maritime history. And that is why the Marine is in there. So it was the USMHS. And that was way back in 1798. We were already aware of this disease being spread by ships, and it was to provide health services for our merchant marines. In fact, 20 cents of every paycheck from the U.S. Merchant Marine went to building marine hospitals. And marine hospitals were established all around the periphery in the country. And that was because our hospitals, we didn't want to subject them, people in the hospital, citizens, to these infectious diseases. And they were, to be truthful, a kind of a scruffy lot, and there was a lot of complaints, especially from society women. They really didn't want those dirty sailors in their hospitals. And that was one of the reasons that these marine hospitals were established, to take care of our U.S. Merchant Marine. We were a young country, and we depended almost entirely on ships coming and going, bringing us goods and services. So that was real important for us to protect. So, but by 1871, it was reorganized, and it became, Congress established the MHS, that's the Marine Hospital Service, Commissioned Corps. And it was they were issued uniforms with military-type ranking, and they also enacted a National Quarantine Act, the law to prevent contagious disease from entering the United States. In 1891, federal legislation mandated the health inspection of all incoming vessels in order to prevent infectious disease from entering the country. The responsibility for enforcing this was given to the Marine Hospital Service. And they were the people that had to inspect people and make sure that we didn't open the gate to people that we did not want. The wording for that legislation is rather interesting. The law stipulated the exclusion of all idiots, insane persons, paupers, or persons likely to become a public charge, persons suffering from a loathsome or dangerous contagious disease, and criminals. We wanted to keep this country clean. During this time, the emblem for the Public Health Service, which really was established way back when it first was started, did not change. The actual emblem is the caduceus of Mercury. Now that's the caduceus with the wings and the 2 snakes. And the wings on the caduceus of Mercury were to signify Godspeed those merchant marine and sailors and get them where they're going, because we need that because of the bottom line here. We need the commerce going on here. That is often used especially on television commercials, as actually the Public Health Service, the medical symbol. That's incorrect. If you look on an ambulance, you will see the actual caduceus of Asclepius, and that's 1 staff and 1 snake, and that is the real symbol. But the guy with wings is so much cuter that we have to use that, and you can swing it around, on the television, and it looks good. Many people think that really is the medical symbol. So there you have that bit of trivia. Underneath that caduceus of Mercury, you will see a fouled anchor. Now, fouled is a maritime use of the word. It means all tangled up. And that fouled anchor, that signifies the sick and disabled seaman. So that double symbol with the anchor and the caduceus of Mercury are to signify the duties of the Public Health Service. And that has remained the Marine Hospital Service until 1902. And then they decided, well, we're doing a little bit more than that. We're beginning to expand a little. We're changing the name to the Public Health and Marine Hospital Service. And until 1912, that was the symbol. And we do have that on an artifact that was left here. One of the bottles actually has that symbol on it. It was a short period of time that that was in use. By 1912, it was decided that that was too cumbersome. We need to shorten that. And in 1912, it became what it is today, our U.S. Public Health Service.
We have a couple of outdoor signs that really signified this was the quarantine station. One was posted on, there was a boardwalk that went the whole length of the river, out by the river, and there was one posted on either entrance. So with the backdrop of our pandemic now, you can see that signage was very important. It was no trespassing. You had to have a pass if you were going to walk through the station to the little town of Knappton, which is just east of here. The other sign we have is quite interesting. It's a no trespassing sign, a government no trespassing sign on this Electro. And the Electro was a steamer ship that transported the personnel from the Astoria offices of the Public Health Service over here to the station. The Electro was also used to meet incoming ships. So if the ship was coming in, the officers that would inspect the ship would be on that Electro steamer and go out to meet the ship and determine whether the ship even needed to come over here. And the fun thing about that sign is that you can see on this picture of the Electro, the Public Health Service personnel are lined up on top in their uniforms in a nice straight line. And if you look really carefully at the very top middle of this ship, you will see this very sign right there on the ship. So that's a fun thing that we have to show here. The other thing that we have that is a very outdoor indication that do not come here, this is a quarantine area, is the flagpole that was on the dock. It would have been flying this yellow quarantine flag when there was a ship in quarantine here. So this was huge. It's very faded now, but at the time it was quite a bit brighter, and it would signal, this was a maritime symbol that's understood by all mariners, this is quarantine. Don't come near here. Stay away. We have a lot of fun written information that was left here at the station. Some of it is in the form of medical supply books, and some of it is in the form of some public health service publications. These provide us with a lot of fun images, vintage images of the past, and a lot of the symbols, the public health symbols as they changed through the years, and some really wonderful graphics. We have some very gruesome pictures of the veins in your hand. We don't quite know, why this medical book was here, but it's really a fun one to look at. We have a great wheelchair book for any, wheelchairs that you might need to order in that time era. And then we have some just priceless quotes from the Public Health Service. We have one from a Public Health Service bulletin in 1912. It's a word to ship captains. Rats carry plague. Mosquitoes carry yellow fever. Plague and yellow fever cause quarantine. Quarantine means expense. Ship captains, destroy your rats and mosquitoes and not only save owners money, but save lives. So this is a direct order to those ship captains to clean up their ships. They're talking, dollar signs. That's the important thing. And then we have another one, another public health bulletin. This is also from 1912. And this says, when a person catches any one of these diseases, even his friends consider him loathsome, and so he is. And the first thing they say is, take him at once to the pest house. They are saying it now, and they will keep on saying it. So quarantine is here to stay. And with our backdrop of our pandemic, we know this is so true. We've got a lot of our medical supply books and other public health bulletins from this era displayed on Ole's desk here. Ole Estes was a long time, very beloved worker here at the station, and he made this desk. He was a carpenter by trade and became the supervising attendant here. He was really the caretaker for this place, and you can see his desk. Here's his ink bottle was left here also, and it's a fun reminder of the many talents that this man had. You never know what's going to wash up on our shore. About 100 years ago, the neighbor over here, Harold Hagerup, he had found this peg leg, and his kids played with it for years. And then when my mom came around, he thought it was time to pass this fun toy along to her. So he brought over this peg leg, gave it to her for a birthday present. It really shows you how we've come quite a long way in healing this kind of an injury. But it still provides quite a bit of fun for dress up and reminds us of the rich maritime history in this area.
My name is Samantha Stearman. I have a degree in anthropology with an emphasis of archaeology from Portland State University. I first discovered Knappton Cove a little over 10 years ago when I came here completely on a whim and noticed the artifacts that they had in the museum. And I knew right away how important this place was. There is stuff here that I haven't seen in other museums locally, and I knew this place was really special. The archaeological record is really important because it tells us a story. It fills in a piece of the puzzle that we might not know. There's no record from the Chinook. I mean, we know they were here, but there's no written record. So those artifacts speak for themselves. The cannery, those artifacts speaks for themselves. It's really, really interesting, and I'm really excited to be a part of it.
We have shards that were recovered down on the beach, some of them that my brother found that have that old symbol, that MHS on it.
I just walked along and my toe scrubbed against something white, and I looked down and I picked up this piece of pottery. And as I picked it up, there was another one next to it, so I picked it up and looked at them, and they had the USMHS on it, and I thought, wow, this is part of the hospital. So I brought it in and then washed it and glued it together, gave it to them for their museum. Collection of this stuff just has been with me of always, probably keeping the beach clean of stuff, and then it expanded to picking up these pieces that were more interesting. Sometimes there would be just plain bottles of different things, and the pan was in the old shop, and I never thought a whole lot about it except until later I saw that it had the USMHS on it. I was going to use it to wash old car parts in, but it had a hole in the bottom, but I saved it anyway. This bottle was found in the end of the shop building, and that is where I found also the original blueprint for this hospital building. But this had the oldest logo on it, and I gave it to Mom, and she had it on her mantle for years. I just found it out in the yard somewhere buried. They would use these a lot in the cannery for sealing out the cans. That was fun to find too.
That verifies that this station was in action before 1902. It started in 1899. Anytime anybody sees an USMHS, please send it to me, because that is significant of that era before 1902. That signifies that. I'd like you to look out on the river right in front of us. But if you look at that piling field, you will see at the each end of that piling field, you will see some larger piling. Those are called dolphins, and they're used to anchor ocean-going vessels. They look kind of like skinny teepees, and there's two of them. One set at the east end and one at the west end. And those were creosoted, so they have not rotted. The rest of the building has, of course, since that time been salvaged or gone in the drink. But that was a huge building. It was 250 feet by 60, so it was a long, narrow building. Then it was divided into two parts. The east end of the building was outfitted for showers for people coming in, both crew and immigrants. The first thing you had to do was go through health inspection, and those bathrooms were separate for men and women, and they were on that east end of the building. While your ship would moor at the east end, those two dolphins on the east end, you would enter that building, and while you were going through the health and cleaning up process, all of your belongings were put into the west side of the building, and they went through delousing retorts. That was to make sure that there were no germs that were embedded in your clothing and your luggage. So while you were doing that, then your ship was fumigated. And to fumigate those ships early on, they burned big vats of sulfur, and that they sealed off the ship, and the sulfur dioxide fumes that came off hopefully killed lots of those rats. We had a lot of rat problems, certainly infested ships at that time. They were a big problem, and the fleas on the rats did carry the bubonic plague, plus they weren't very clean, and that was a detriment to healthy conditions. After you passed health inspection and your clothes were cleaned up, by the way, that only took about an hour to fumigate your clothes, delouse your clothing, you had to have a place to stay. And initially they had tents set up on the grounds where crew and passengers, and they still were using that old Lamley house for some of that also, for housing people. But for a while they brought in a gunboat retired from the Spanish-American War, and the USS Concord was put right out there by those dolphins on the west end, and we have pictures that were taken that were left here at the station. They were pretty proud to have that great big boat out there to look at, and that was your accommodation for that 48 hours while you were waiting for your ship to be cleaned up so that you could proceed upriver. The Oregonian article in 1921 did a full report on this, and they showed a picture of the Concord, and that it was a double spread, and this is the article that this text is embedded that says, "The Ellis Island for this district is located on the Washington side of the river near Knappton." Now that would be the little town a quarter of a mile upriver. And it ends with, "Thanks to the vigilance of the quarantine on the Columbia River, our cities have yet to experience the plague." So we were doing good. In fact, the United States really is credited due to the Commissioned Corps and the U.S. Health Service to prevented disease from entering the country. Pretty successful. It really worked pretty well. Of course, we kept a few folks out that we didn't really want then also, but the primary role was to keep infectious disease from spreading throughout the country. Our most important artifact here really is this building, the lazaretto, the pest house. The quarantine hospital has several monikers. Lazaretto stems from the early mariners. Lazarettos were built to curb infectious disease. It was to quarantine people, and that comes from the biblical referral to Lazarus, the old sick and disabled guy, and that was to take care of people who were infected. So they are also called a pest house. That's a translation really from that, and that's what this is. This quarantine hospital itself, since it was the most significant building left on the premises in pretty good shape, this was when we decided to see if we could keep this building, because it really tells the history of that particular era in time. The building itself is laid out like a duplex. It has duplicate features on each side of the building. The little building was built only to house 20 patients. There are 2 large wards, so you enter the building, and to the right and to the left, you will see a large ward, and on each end of the building, and those were walled off, on each end of the building there are 2 isolation wards. It's interesting that they do share a bathroom, but this was pretty functional at the time. There were 4 working bathrooms, and there still are. Well, most of them work in this building. They were shut off by doors. Evidently that protected the germs from flowing back and forth, but each of those isolation wards also has an exterior entry, so that a person who was isolated could be serviced from that outside area for food and medical attention, and would be quarantined in that little room. We actually have the blueprint for this hospital building that my brother found, and it has been very helpful. Students from Clatsop Community College Historic Preservation School have been able to utilize that blueprint to help us with the preservation of this building and try to keep it as authentic as possible. We've also been fortunate to get nice grants. We formed a 501c3, which allowed us to apply for grant money and to accept donations. And that has helped us to restore this building. The Kinsman Foundation out of Milwaukee, Oregon has been very generous with us and have funded funds for a new roof, foundation repair, and heating for this building. A lot of things that people don't notice when you go into a historic site, but there are a lot of unseen things that are primary to take care of if you want to save the old building. One of the main reasons we really want to preserve this building is that from research from our board, one of our board members has determined that this is actually the last quarantine hospital, the lazaretto of this period, built by the government for these stations, that remains open to the public. Many of the pest houses were burned because they were afraid that that infectious disease might still linger. Or they are in such disrepair that they are not safe enough to allow the public to visit. So we think it is really crucial that we attempt to really preserve this building as an example of that era and the quarantine that was necessary to control disease. Okay. Another interesting artifact that we have is a little cupola that was on top of the water tower. That the water, of course, was very important to this station. In fact, it was piped all the way out that long dock, the gangway to the dock, for those showers out on the pier out there. So, and of course, there's a lot of laundry involved with a hospital facility, and there's always a need for water. And that was a bit of a problem here. Much kind of research went into this. They tried digging a well, that didn't work, and they finally decided to use the water from a little stream that runs up the hill behind us here. And that stream, they made a little reservoir that was way back up on the hill, and that fed into this water tower, beautiful redwood water tower that was put on the premises over on the east end of the property. That deteriorated certainly through the years, and by the time my folks had purchased the place, it was in disrepair. And that is one of the things that our Clatsop Community College students have restored, and we have placed that on the side of the property, on the west side of the property. We have what we call Artifact Alley, and some of those big things that we really couldn't put in the museum are on display over in Artifact Alley. So you'll want to explore that when you come here. It's got some kind of interesting things there. In 1950, when I had just turned 12 years old, this piece of property went up for sale. And our father, who was a teacher in Benson High School in Portland, decided that he would like to buy this. My brother Tom found this place, and they came down and looked at it.
I heard about Fort Columbia being offered surplus by the government, so I got a little brochure, and it explained that there was this 5 acres, give or take, of dry land that had been the U.S. quarantine station, and the government decided to sell it surplus too. They had quit operating it in 1938, and so it kind of just sat idle for the most part during the war. But when he came home, I told Dad, he came down and looked at it, and he asked me how much I'd pay for it if I were to buy it. And here I am, a college kid, no money. I said, well, if I had all the money in the world, I'd bid $2,500. And so he talked the vice principal of the school into going into partnership with him, and they each put in $2,500, and they got it and started working on it on weekends. And then I got drafted right away. So after I came home from my tour of duty, every summer I would help him with the summer camp, fishing camp. continued to do that for years, even after I graduated from school, college, and got a job in Southern California. I'd come up every summer and help Dad with the place.
Because Dad was a teacher, he always looked for employment during the summer, and he looked at this place and said, wow, we've got this beautiful place for mooring boats. We've got a lovely place we can accommodate people with their tents and campers. It's in a great fishing hole, and they indeed got the place. So this became a very important part of my life from 1950 until today. And Dad ran a very successful sport fishing camp. We came every summer and most weekends during the winter to do maintenance down here. Fishing in the 50s, where the big derbies were going on, salmon derbies were very popular. And you paid $2 a day to buy a ticket. And at the end of the day, all of the fish that came into the different ports, it was the different campgrounds and ports around the area, were weighed, and whoever had the largest salmon that day got the prize for that day. And at the culmination of all of these derbies, which the derbies went on for several weeks, the grand prize, of course, was the big winner that you got. That was, you got $1,000, I think, for that winning fish at that time. And that was a lot of money back then. Dad ran a very successful camp here. He set me out in business. There was a little pump house out on the dock. We made that into a tackle and coffee shop. I sold Boyd's coffee, and it's a fishing tackle, and I became quite a salesman on the fishing tackle. We fished with salmon plugs then. The big hot plug of the day was the Lucky Louie. Well, unfortunately for us, Lucky Louie's had the franchise at the ferry landing, which is 2 miles downriver. So we couldn't sell that, so we sold Wallace Highliners, and boy did I pitch Wallace Highliners and tell how many big fish were caught on those. To tell you the truth, we also had Lucky Louie plugs that we fished with ourselves. But that was a going concern. We had 75 boats moored here at the peak season one year. People camped in the campground. You had to pay $2 a day or $20 a season to fish and camp here. It was a pretty good deal. And we had lots of entertainment and good friends that came out of this. People came every year to fish here because of the campground. The campground closed when my dad retired, and they moved down here and had a lovely retirement then. And I do have to say that the proceeds from the campground, not so much from my selling of my goods at the tackle shop, but from the $2 a day that people were paying, helped put me through Oregon State College. So I have this place to thank for my college degree. In 1980, this site was actually put on the National Register. The Pacific County Historical Society decided that this was worthy of the National Register, and they did all the research and background. That's quite a process. And when I realized what went into this, I thought, we can't just let this die out. I felt pretty obligated that we really needed to preserve this part of history. So that's kind of what spurred me on to do this. So in 1995, my daughter, Heather, and I decided we would form the Knappton Cove Heritage Center. We envisioned all kinds of things that we could do here, some of which have been realized, and some of them we realized were a little too far out. But we succeeded in getting this established. And 10 years later, in 2005, we realized something. The roof needed repair. We got an estimate for that, and it was $17,000. And we thought, whoops, that's a little over our comfort level here. And then the foundation needed terrible repair. Because of clear cutting behind us on the hill behind us in previous years, the foundation had slipped on the east end considerably. Well, that was a real expensive item. So we thought, what are we going to do? And that was when we got the bright idea, let's try forming a private nonprofit. That would allow us to at least apply for grants and to get membership and donors, and that happened. And we got that certification from the IRS, so we are a legitimate nonprofit. And after that started, we just began to be a team. We formed a board that expanded, and this whole effort has been a total team effort. We would never have been able to do this on our own. We've been very fortunate to have lots of historic interest in this place. And we think now that quarantine has been catapulted into the limelight that maybe more people will even be interested. Our goal was to preserve, first of all, this building, and that we felt this was important. The structure was fairly sound. With a little improvement, it could be saved. And that, we've pretty much accomplished that, thanks to, as I mentioned, the Kinsman Foundation and Classic Community College, and some other donors, and our memberships, and nice donations from people from the public that just are interested in helping preserve this place has kept us afloat. We've been very successful, I think, in reaching this point. The future is a little uncertain. We look at options at what could happen to this place. We feel very strongly that with enough interest and enough support from people in the community and possibly some government resources, we'll see. We have partnered a little bit with the National Park Service, that we can forge ahead and keep this as a place that reminds us of our history here in the Pacific Northwest with something very tangible. We think it's really important that people experience history where it happened. You can really think about people, immigrants that may have come here, crew members that spent time here, ships that came here. It's just a treasure trove of history of this area. And we also know that quarantine is here to stay, and this is a reminder that we don't forget that. So we hope we will have a good future ahead, and we invite anybody who's interested to contact us, and we always welcome input and research information, anything you can do to help us achieve our goal.